This is David Pietrusza, and I'm mispronouncing my own name. But you're watching. It's not the easiest name.
Yeah.
But I'm sort of used to it. And you're watching the Break It Down show, where we're clearly breaking down today.
Seriously. I had to get my dog into the house because she was barking at the neighbor. My gear is not working right today. Who knows why? But either way, I've got Josiah with me here, and we got David. David is a fantastic author. He's written a zillion books about what I guess I would say mid 20th century is what you focus on, and going from like, I don't know, maybe the teens all the way into almost modern times. How would you characterize your era of time that you write about? Because you're clearly fascinated by certain characters and time frames.
Yeah, I mean the earliest stuff I've done in my current iteration of what passes for a career is Theodore Roosevelt and getting into the World War I era, what leads up to that, and then taking it into as far as 1960. And I've dabbled with maybe going into 1964 as well, but I've drawn back for that from a variety of reasons. And I think the earlier, the better. The 20s, the 30s, the teens, and that's sort of my sweet spot, is to use an old baseball phrase.
Yeah. Well, do you want me to come in here, Peter?
Yes.
Yeah. So I was curious because you have done a bunch of books on presidential elections, right? And I think it was 1920 was the first one.
1920 was the first, yeah.
Yeah, and then there's also 32, 48, 60, all sorts of years. But why? So, I mean, we've had a bunch of elections. I don't know that if you ask most people, 1920 would not spring to mind as like a critical year necessarily. Although, as you go into, there's a lot of interesting stuff that happens. So, like, why did you pick 1920? Why did you think that was, such a rich topic?
Well, I picked it out for a very flimsy reason on one level, because I was looking at playing a mental trivia game in my mind, and like, so 1960 would have like 3 presidents or future presidents actively contesting, LBJ and Nixon and JFK, and then you flip over to 1964, and you've only got LBJ, and 68 you get into oddly enough Nixon and Reagan, and that's it. We tend to forget Reagan was in play that year, but in any case, 3, 2, 1 people. But 1920, then you had 6 presidents, counting TR, who would have been the candidate of the Republicans, who would have won in a walk and been returned to the White House, along with Wilson, Harding, Coolidge, Hoover, Franklin Roosevelt, who's on the ticket as a vice presidential candidate of the Democrats. And so you've got all those people. But even though that original impetus was pretty flimsy, it was building on a very solid ground of all sorts of stuff I had been studying. So when the book finally came together, I realized, wow, all of the stuff I've been studying for decades and accumulating about, say, the League of Nations, the Klan, Prohibition, women's suffrage, all of those backstories gave real heft to the story of just the election itself. I was once at Book Expo in New York City, and I was wandering around and talking to somebody in another booth, and he said, well, what book are you most famous for? I said, well, 1920, the year of 6 presidents. And what's that about? Well, and he goes, and I said, well, it's in like its 10th paperback printing now. And he says, how did that happen? How did you manage to do 10 printings of a book about the election of Warren Harding? And I said, well, because it's a pretty good book. and it really is a pretty good book. And people have ranked it very highly in terms of, if not the highest in some cases, among all presidential election books. So and it depends on how it's written. And I honed my skills on writing some early baseball books. And I was thinking about that this morning. What was the takeaway from that? And the takeaway is you write, and you learn what not to do and how to do it better, and how to add to the process and make it a more readable experience. So the previous book, and this was on the internet, maybe a Twitter, somebody was doing about a week ago on famous first lines of books.
Yeah.
And it reminded me of my previous book, previous to 1920, which was a book on the gangster Arnold Rothstein, of all people. But again, that time frame of the teens and the 20s. And the first line of that, after much trial and error, I put down on the page, and his nickname was among his nicknames was AR. And the first line of that book was, AR bet he was going to die. So you come in with a good line, you come in with something that's going to get people's attention. The first line of 1920 is, the president of the United States lay bleeding on the bathroom floor. You grab their attention, and then, of course, you have to keep their attention for about 400 more pages.
Yes, right. Yeah. Very, very, very gripping opening.
Right. Don't think you've got it conquered after that one sentence.
Yeah. So, what was the president doing on the bathroom, bloody on the bathroom floor?
He had just had a massive stroke. The president in question is Woodrow Wilson. He's already had a bunch of strokes. He had a minor stroke before he was president of the United States, and was sort of told to slow down, keep his schedule under wraps. And so he did not spend a lot of time working in the presidency because of that. Then when he comes back from the League of Nations, he has something going kablooey in his brains while at the Versailles conference, comes back to sell the League of Nations to the American people in a very grueling tour of the United States. And it's interesting how two presidents of the United States conk out one after another with these big, almost unprecedented Western tours while they're president. Woodrow Wilson has this, getting ahead of it, Warren Harding has a big stroke or a heart attack when he is touring the West and Alaska, and dies in San Francisco in 1923. But Wilson has his stroke first one in Pueblo, Colorado. And really, the tour is cut short on the platform while he's speaking. He's led off the stage. That's bad, folks. But it gets worse when he's in the White House, gets up in the middle of the night and has a massive, massive stroke and hits his head on the sink and lies bleeding on the bathroom floor, and is really not much of a president after that. And the question is, who is the president? Is it his wife, his second wife, or is there no president? Is the country leaderless in a time when we have to convert from a wartime economy, when we have to get ourselves established in international politics with the League of Nations, et cetera, and while we're still fighting the tail end of that first big pandemic that we had, the Spanish flu?
Yeah,
go ahead. Let me jump in here, Josiah. Yeah. So, and then also we have Coolidge after that, who has a significant death in his family. It's like 3 presidents in a row where they're waylaid by these deaths, because I think it's fair to say that Coolidge wasn't the same president after his son dies too. Is that correct?
You start looking from like Cleveland on as to what happens with the presidents in the White House. Cleveland has that cancerous growth in his jaw, and he has this a secret operation on a boat on the presidential yacht, I think, in the Potomac. So you start there. Then McKinley comes in, and the first tragedy is not his assassination, but his wife is a very sickly person, and he has to guard her health. He is assassinated, of course. Things aren't too bad with Theodore Roosevelt. You'd say, well, nothing bad happened there, but he has a boxing match in the White House because he's Theodore Roosevelt, damn it. And with a young naval officer, and the naval officer pops him in the eye, and he loses his eyesight in one eye, which is kept a secret from the public. Then you go to William Howard Taft, who didn't want to be president. His wife Nellie wanted him to be president, but they don't get to enjoy it because Nellie Taft has a stroke. And then Woodrow Wilson's first wife dies in his first term. And then what we went into with Wilson and his strokes. Then Harding, his wife is incapacitated for a good year. It looks like she's going to die first, the Duchess, Florence Harding. And then Harding dies on that trip to Alaska. So until Hoover, and then of course Hoover doesn't have health problems, so Hoover has other problems, and then that sort of streak ends. But you've got this real streak of horrible bad health. And if you want to jump from Cleveland back to Chester Arthur comes down with Bright's disease while he's in the White House and can't run again, is very weakened, and he becomes president because his predecessor, Garfield, has been shot. So it's not a job where you want to sell life insurance or health insurance to the occupants.
Rothstein wouldn't have written out a lot of policies for these guys.
Not on him, no. But Arnold did bet he was going to. What that reference was, that he was also in the insurance. He was a legitimate businessman. So he was in real estate. He was in insurance. And one of the things he would write insurance policies on is if you borrowed money from him, and he was a big loan shark. So if something happened to you, he'd collect his money one way or the other. And at that point, he was writing a bigger insurance policy on himself just before he goes and gets shot fatally and over a bad gambling death. So that was a bet he won in a way you don't want to win.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I guess it's good to be protected at least. I was going to ask about the League of Nations, because you mentioned that Wilson he had his stroke when he was doing his campaign to try and get approval for it, which didn't happen. And I know, I mentioned this because I know you later wrote a book. One of your other books involves like the rise of Hitler in Germany or whatever. And I guess people say that the fact that the U.S. didn't join the League of Nations, maybe that had something to do. Do you think that would have had any effect on the course of events and the build up to World War II, or no?
Actually, no. I mean, here's an interesting thing which doesn't get considered much. So Franklin Roosevelt had been this big Wilsonian. Hoover had been a Wilsonian too. But Wilson Franklin has a big Democratic majority. There's never any move to get America back into the United Nations. There's no great desire on the American people to do that. America is becoming more and more isolationist in the 30s, even than it was, say, in the 20s. You have all these neutrality acts, et cetera, et cetera. One of the key things when Roosevelt is running for president in 1936 is to give his speech, and international tensions are growing then, particularly with the Spanish Civil War. And he goes at Chautauqua and gives this speech about how I hate war, and which is kind of like the signal which he's going to make in 1940. He's not going to send your boys into a foreign war. America doesn't want to be involved in these things, even if it was a member of the League of Nations. Was it going to then, send troops into the Rhineland or the Ruhr or Austria or the Sudetenland to do anything about Germany? I would say no. The British and the French weren't doing it. They were members of the League of Nations. Germany goes into the League of Nations in the 20s, comes out in the 30s. Russia joins people. It's like sort of like a revolving door of who's a member, who's coming and who's going. But it's just really a debating society. It really doesn't do much to stop wars any more than the United Nations really has. The wars which occur, post 1945 occur, and how much the United Nations has to do with stopping any other wars, I would say nothing. It's the face-to-face diplomacy between the great powers, i.e., say the Cuban Missile Crisis, which are of more effect than whether what Adlai Stevenson is saying on the floor of the United Nations later on.
So one thing it's always a little hard for me to get my head around when I read about the politics of this era is, I'm used to today all the conservatives favor the Republican Party and all the progressives favor the Democratic Party, more or less. And it seems like in this period, you don't really have that. It's kind of mix and match. It's not always easy to say what divides the two parties. So, I mean, like what divides what's the difference between a Republican and a Democrat in the 1920s, say?
Ha! Depends who you're talking to. And, in the Republican Party, Harding and Coolidge are very conservative and would be as pretty much as defined by, shall we say, modern day post-war conservatism. Whereas then Theodore Roosevelt, a big progressive, both small p progressive, large p progressive, forming a third party. Guys like Senators Borah and Hiram Johnson, very liberal people in the Republican Party. Fiorello LaGuardia at this point and throughout the 1930s. People who today would be called rhinos, okay? So you've got them all chock-a-block in the Republican Party. And then in the Democratic Party, okay, who's a member of that? Are there it's an oversimplification to say that all the Southern Democrats are conservatives, because they're not. In the 1930s and 1920s, you're going to get Huey Long coming out of the South, and he's, his economic program, Share the Wealth, not conservative by any means. A fellow like Claude Pepper in the 30s, who was so liberal, he was known as Claude Red Pepper, senator from Florida, and the populists, Tom Watson and people like that in the South. So it's a mishmash of people in the South, and then you have the big city bosses, the moderate progressives in the Democratic Party, like Woodrow Wilson, who doesn't start out like Franklin Roosevelt, does not start out as a progressive, starts out as fairly conservative, very much opposed to the agrarian populists who make up another segment of the Democratic Party under William Jennings Bryan. The people in the East, whether they are Republicans or Democrats, can't stand the populism of William Jennings Bryan. They not only on substance, but they just think he's a complete horse's ass. So in many cases, the divide is geographic as much as ideological. It's a mishmash, and it's a total patchwork of things, and it doesn't get sorted out. It doesn't even start to get sorted out until maybe the 1960s.
Oh, Pete, did you say something? I couldn't hear you.
I was actually testing my microphone. I think I finally got everything sorted out from 20.
I was just going to say, one thing that I guess is like a big internal party division is the Prohibition issue, the wets versus the dries.
Yeah, that's interesting too, because you'd say, well, the conservatives would be for Prohibition, and the progressives or the people on the left or the more liberals would be opposed. And again, that's not the case. One of the points I like to make in my books is don't look for the same left-right divide that that exists now. So that many of the progressives are prohibitionists, like, again, Hiram Johnson and William E. Borah, the senators from the western part of the state. The Republican progressives are very much strong prohibitionists. And a guy like Harding and a guy like Coolidge, they could care less. They're really not prohibitionists. And particularly with Harding, it's like, okay, this is what the voters want today. I'll vote for it, but I don't care. And that's one of the problems with the failure of prohibition in the 20s, is that the Republican administrations of that point are not interested in enforcing it. The amount of money which is put into it is very negligible. And it's only when Hoover starts to do his sort of Wonder Boy act and try to figure out how to solve the problem of a law which is not everyone is in favor of and not too many people are breaching, then the whole issue kind of blows up and gets raised to, okay, what are we going to do with this? Maybe are we going to reform this? Are we going to change it? Are we going to abolish it, et cetera, et cetera? And the same process holds to a much greater extent with women's suffrage, where it's like, well, the Republicans aren't going to be for that. It's going to be the Democrats, right? Wrong. And that's because, in part because of the Democrats in the South being almost, but not entirely, opposed to women's suffrage, and in the big city machines for quite a while, until the end, when public opinion flips, and then they get back in the East is very conservative. The West is less conservative. So it's the Western states which put women's suffrage in. As late as like 1915, there are 3 big referenda in the Eastern states on women's suffrage: Massachusetts, New York, and Pennsylvania. And they all go down like a rock in terms of women voting. And it is not until 2 years later, when women's suffrage passes in New York State, and again when the vote in New York City flips, because previous to that the upstate vote had been for women's suffrage and the vote in the city had been opposed, that you see the signal to the rest of the country that the train is leaving the station on women's suffrage, and sort of get on board politicians, because if you don't, you're going to see politicians' careers left in the dust. And a bunch of big name politicians, like a Senator John Weeks of Massachusetts, a Republican, and a Senator Salisbury of Delaware, who are targeted by the suffragettes. And when they go down, it sends a signal to the other guys: get on board. You don't want to be ex-office holders. You don't want to be ex-United States senators. There's one very interesting case later on of a senator from New York who is both anti-prohibition and anti-women's suffrage, and he loses his seat in 1926 and to Robert Wagner, in part because of the women's vote and because of his opposition to prohibition, which is really very unpopular in New York, and his opposition to women's suffrage. Why does he oppose both those issues? For a very consistent reason: states' rights. States' rights, that the Prohibition administration takes the power out of the hands of the states, and actually so does the National Suffrage Amendment. Something to consider. Misconceptions about both amendments. One, women did have the right to vote, but not in every state. I mean, in state after state after state, they were being able to vote. It is when that amendment passes in August 1920 that it becomes nationwide and really gives the women the right to vote, mostly in the South, because those are the states which are not allowing it at that point. And also, it's like, so prohibition means you can't drink? Prohibition means you can't have booze? Absolutely not. It talks about the manufacture, transportation, and sale of booze under most circumstances, not all, in terms of medicinal booze. I mean, you could still do that, and that was a loophole that was mightily abused. But with the you could, and the very wealthy, including Franklin Roosevelt, would stock up with very great wine cellars and to hopefully wait out how long this amendment was going to last. So a lot of nuances to these amendments as to how they were passed and how they were enforced and what they actually meant.
I'm curious. So with things we learn about as we do the show is all these different things kind of tie together. And we look at, a two-party system that the parties evolve all the time. We often focus on presidents because we can remember their names, maybe. But
I think it's a very handy way to learn American history.
Okay.
It's a great shortcut because if you try to learn the whole thing in one big bite, you're going to choke on it. So presidents enable you to take smaller bite-sized bites.
But the people that have the real power are often not that president. I mean, if you look at someone like Hoover, you couldn't pick a better person, better resume for president. We've done this a lot. George Bush the Elder had a great resume for president. President Obama has essentially no resume for president, and we have all these different outcomes. So it's really hard to know like what the qualifications for a good president are. Do you have an idea? I mean, you could never elect a self-educated guy who grew up in a log cabin anymore. Like those days are probably gone. But what are the hallmarks of someone do you think that are successful? Because we suck at picking this stuff reliably.
Well, political skills. I mean, administrative skills are one thing. Hoover has all the administrative skills. He has like minus zero political skills. And then you have Franklin Roosevelt, who is, creating all these rivalries within his administration. It's going to be Ickes versus Hopkins versus this guy versus that guy. And people are feuding. And then you take a look at who's leaving by the time of the third term and whatever. And all the changes he makes from what he's running on in 1932 and how the first New Deal is different from the second New Deal. And it looks like a ball of confusion, but yet, 4 terms. Why? Because he has the political skills. He has the skills to communicate what he wants at any given point and to reassure people, to create this persona of, I'm on your side. I'm not someone to be afraid of. And if things are starting to go wrong or, you've still got 17% unemployment in 1938, trust me, it'll get better. And also the skill of knowing who to run against. And Franklin Roosevelt always has a great good fortune to, as long as he's in, to still be running against Herbert Hoover and the Depression of 1936 and against the media. There's a drumbeat in his once he's the president to run against the media, just as we see in more recent terms. And that's one of the great failures of, well, I don't want to get into the current situations, but I mean, political skills and being able to reassure people, et cetera, really are key. That's what you're in part elected by and what you're elected for.
Do you think
that's great?
Oh, yeah. I was going to ask, do you think, politics back then seemed to be a lot more machine focused? You had the candidates selected in the smoke filled rooms or whatever. Is that maybe a little do we underrate that as like a method of picking people versus what we have now?
Well, one of the great mechanisms for vetting candidates and stopping front runners was the 2/3 rule the Democrats had and the Republicans never did. And that plays a great role. It really starts to hamstringing the Democrats in the 20th century, where Alton B. Parker is this great compromise candidate in 1904, and he goes down like a rock. And the same thing with John W. Davis in 1924 after 103 ballots at Madison Square Garden. And even Woodrow Wilson with, I think, 44 ballots in Baltimore. And he's ready to pull out at one point and just, okay, I've tried, I've failed, it's over. And his future son-in-law says, no. This is William Gibbs McAdoo, the former or future Treasury Secretary. No, stay in. It can still work. But, it will knock out a lot of the front runners. And also the fact that you, in the Republican Party, if you can't get the majority because of all the favorite sons, you have all these favorite son candidacies, and it's tough to run the boards as you now can with Super Tuesday. Super Tuesday and that primary system seems to be the make or break. You sweep all of those, whether you're in the Republican or the Democrat Party, and you've become almost have an insurmountable lead. I mean, that's how Biden was able to pull it off last time out. And that wasn't an unusual circumstance at all.
Another thing that fascinates me is throughout history, we have these moments where we have these big fights, Prohibition, female suffrage. These are only 100 years ago, not even that far back. There's people that were alive, that are still alive today, when this was happening. We struggle to get these things right, but we seem to look back in the rearview mirror like it was easy. It's often one or two people that flip or turn or do the vote, and these big movements happen. So I think we're a little hard on ourselves these days because we don't realize how improbable a lot of these things were, I suppose. Is that getting better?
We're hard on ourselves, and we're hard on the people who sorted it out.
Yeah.
We know. We know what lay 100 years in the future, this way or that way, and we look with greater clarity back, maybe with greater clarity backwards, or maybe our vision is clouded by what we see today. So yeah, I think I mean, you take a look at everything on social media and how everything is. No one can disagree. Nobody can say, I disagree with your position, or
Right.
I believe what you're stating is incorrect. Everything now is you lied, okay, and you should resign. And it's like this is not sound. This is not a sound way of governance or for society as a whole. It would be good to sort of step back and have a little politeness about things and a little understanding about people. It says in the Lord's Prayer, if I may unseparate church and state, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive others. And we're seeing none of that in today's politics.
We also seem to struggle with the context of the time. I mean, if you want to get into a conversation and have it lose its rationality, you start talking about the 2/3 compromise. This is a political decision between the North and the South. And without that, there likely would be a completely different outcome in terms of what country or what countries exist in this space.
Well, the 2/3 compromise, the word compromise is very significant there, because it's like, I mean, if you concentrate on, well, you're saying the black man or the slave is only 2/3 of a human being, and that's the only thing you're getting out of that process, you're missing the point that if they are counted 1-for-1 in South Carolina or wherever, what you're doing is you're increasing the electoral power of the slave states. So by counting a slave as 2/3 of the population of a person for the population of that state for the census, and then for the House of Representatives, then you're weakening the power of the slave states. It's also interesting that after the Civil War, you would get similar arguments by proponents of black suffrage or of women's suffrage, and the arguments would run this way: take it down to zero. Don't put it down to 2/3. Take it down to zero. If black people can't vote in South Carolina, then don't count them in terms of how many representatives they're going to have or how many electoral votes. If women can't vote in, again, South Carolina or Georgia, then don't count them. And these are the women making the arguments. Don't count them and weaken their representation in the House. Weaken it in the House of Representatives. So, you know, all these issues are more complex, shall we say, than if you want to throw bombs at the dead, you know.
I wanted to ask, yeah. So I wanted to ask about, you know, what your perspective on like the relevance of history, right? I remember I recently was reading a book about Alaric the Goth, right?
Oh, okay.
So very, very old, outside your time. But, you know, in the first page of this book, the author was comparing the situation of the Goths to the family separations policy under Donald Trump. Like, also, like, everything was just about now, right? And so I wondered, like, you know, is it like, what do you think about the applicability of history to now, and it's kind of like a tendency to read current controversies back in the past.
Yeah, back when I was doing baseball history, you know, some of the questions you would get would be, you know, how do you compare Babe Ruth to Hank Aaron to Barry Bonds? Okay. And people would say, well, in this day, you had the 154 game season, and then you had the night baseball versus day baseball, and then you had the integration of the game, and et cetera, et cetera. So you had all these changes, and I'd say, all things being equal, all things are never equal. Okay. So you could pick out things which presage what's going on now, but you know, keep in mind that there are all these other variables that really make a one-to-one comparison of things not exactly perfect. And then you can go into what you're saying about Alaric the Goth and immigration policy on the border today, which simply make it laughable, and which you know, the Rorschach test, where everything becomes about what's in your brain to begin with, and then you start putting these lessons onto the past where they don't. People are different today among each other, and people are different between today and 100 or 200 years ago. I mean, they just are. And if you're not going to take all those things into consideration, you know, you're in the wrong business.
One of the guys that we like to throw bombs at, and we've dug him up a number of times, about once a year, we dig up Kennesaw Mountain Landis. And I'm not saying if he's a good guy or bad guy, but
yeah,
his history evolves constantly.
Yeah, I've seen the misinformation about him is quite remarkable, and it's like, well, because his name is Kennesaw Mountain Landis, he's a Southerner. No. His father fought for the Confederacy. No. His father fought against the Confederacy at the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain. Okay. They were Northerners. He was not a conservative. He was again a progressive. So again, don't look for that straight line of where you think things are going to be. He was a TR bull moose type of guy, and a big antitrust person. Very harsh on dissent during World War One. And again, okay, so harsh on dissent in World War One, a prohibitionist. He's going to be a conservative. No, he's a progressive, and all the way through. He couldn't stand Calvin Coolidge, for example. Could not stand him. And when I was doing my biography of Landis, the standard story was, and in large part, this was based on a story which Bill Veeck told in one of his books about being blocked when Veeck wanted to integrate or to stock the entire team during World War II, the Philadelphia Phillies, who were very bad with players from the Negro Leagues, and how it was blocked by Landis. And you can find no real proof of this, and the story makes no great sense. And I thought, well, I have to say in this book how Landis blocked the integration of the game, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I could not find it. And it's like, what do I do? Do I say, do I just go with the standard apocryphal stuff, repeating what other authors have said? And the answer is no, I really shouldn't. And a bunch of research came out afterwards from the Society for American Baseball Research backing up my position on this, and just sort of letting the chips fall where they may. If something comes out later on in the records, then fine. But what it is, it is. When Landis is elected commissioner of baseball in the wake of the Black Sox scandal, the black newspapers in Chicago are completely in his favor. They say this guy has always been fair to us, and we just think he's great. You couldn't have picked someone better. So, it's a complex situation. Would he have? Who was he blocking? Who was he blocking from integrating the game? Which owner? And the answer is, well, the only person he would have been blocking was Branch Rickey. And Branch Rickey was not about to move on integrating the game until after World War II. One, I don't think it would have been, shall we say, politic to replace white ball players who are in the service with black ball players. I don't think that would have flown in that era. But also this was a time when you had race riots in Detroit, and these were white race riots. So you have to be very careful about that. You had Franklin Roosevelt dispatching tanks into Detroit to preserve order. But Branch Rickey was not about to integrate the game until he moves to Brooklyn. Because where was he previously? He was in St. Louis. St. Louis was the only ball franchise, the only city in the major leagues, and of course had two teams then, which were not only segregated in terms of on the field, they were segregated in the grandstand. So he has to wait until he goes out and becomes general manager in Brooklyn, which is, I think, arguably and true, the most liberal city at that point in Major League Baseball. So the time has to be right. And that doesn't occur until Landis is actually dead. And I don't think Landis would have done anything to block the integration of the game then.
Why do you say that? Why wouldn't he have blocked it? What gives you that? I know you've been in the elite.
Because I don't think it. How would he? First off, how would he have blocked it? On what grounds? And he's lawyerly in that regard. He doesn't particularly like many aspects of the farm system. But his power is, again, one of these things of a oversimplification of history. His power is immense, more so than any other commissioner, but it's not overwhelming. He can lose on issues like night baseball or on the farm system. He's not all powerful, and he's also very loyal. And he's also very political. I don't think he would have done anything to block the game. There's nothing in his history which would indicate that. I mean, you just can't find it. So, do we? And when we do this, and we put all the blame on Maine, we're absolving all the other folk. We're absolving all the people in the cities which really were putting out statements that basically no, never, we're not going to do this. The original meeting under Happy Chandler, the successor to Landis, is like everyone is opposed to Branch Rickey, and one of the great people who is opposed is another Hall of Famer, magnate owner Larry McPhail, who was in charge of the Yankees at that point.
Okay,
let me ask one question real quick, and I'll go to Josiah next. Along these lines, we like to say today, we want to be on the right side of history. I don't think that you can pick what side you're on, and if your position's even remembered. I mean, there's got to be all kinds of positions that are just look. How many people can even talk about Calvin Coolidge for more than 5 minutes without running out of stuff to say? So are we able to pick which side? I mean, obviously Branch Rickey ends up on the right side of history, but he also was running a business, so we had to do it in a way that the business could.
Oh, he's a tremendous. Oh, here's the business aspect. Here's where the issue gets complicated. Who's the bad guy? Who's the good guy? The biggest black-owned business, largely black-owned. There was one white owner in Kansas City. The biggest black-owned business around 1945, 1946 are the Negro Leagues, okay? They got operations in all the, major cities, and they may own ballparks and all that, or they may rent the major league ballparks, et cetera, et cetera. It's a big deal. And what is the real asset of a sports franchise? It's the contracts of the players. It's not the baseballs or the bats or what leash you've got on the ballpark. It's the players, okay? They're the ones who put fannies in the seats. When Branch Rickey integrates baseball, he respects none of those contracts. He doesn't pay the Negro League franchises a dime. The guy who I just said is maybe a bad guy because he makes up a story about integrating the Phillies is Bill Veeck. When Bill Veeck signs Negro League players, he buys the contracts from the franchises. So it's like, it's complicated. It's complicated, gang. And also, okay, so Branch Rickey or landed 44, 45, 46, and he dies, and then there's integration. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 1945, no integration, nothing. Not the armed services, not the District of Columbia, pretty much nothing. A lot of jobs handed out under the Works Progress Administration, Public Works Administration to blacks, often in lower levels. There is a switch in loyalty of the black voter in 1936, but in terms of social integration, nothing. And he begs off time and again, even with anti-lynching legislation in the late 30s, even to Eleanor.
Yeah. Good guy, bad guy.
I'm going to talk about Calvin Coolidge for more than 5 minutes. I can.
Well, and then he's replaced by Truman.
Truman again, a complicated situation because Truman is outraged. There's an uptick in lynching and violence against blacks right after the war. Okay. And in the South, there's one case, a couple of cases which are really ugly. And Truman, who may or may not, and probably very likely was briefly a member of the Ku Klux Klan, and you take a look at his personal writings, and even in his memoirs, like in 1955, he says something like, "I have been accused of wanting social equality between the races, and this is not true." It's like, okay, okay, we kind of ignore that. But in 1948, when he's up for re-election, and when he is going to reinstitute the peacetime, or institute really a real peacetime draft, the black community led by A. Philip Randolph is saying basically, hell no, we won't go. We put up with this stuff in World War I, and we put up with this stuff in World War II, and there's an actual war. But we're not going to put up with this time. And there's a poll that says like 35% of the young blacks are not going to register for the black draft. And the blacks are threatening a march on Washington. Harry Truman does not want this in an election year. And he particularly doesn't want it in this election year, because it's not just that he has to worry about the black vote staying home or the black vote switching over to Thomas E. Dewey, who actually was pretty liberal on this issue. New York had the first anti-discrimination law, okay, under Dewey. So there's that. But the real thing he has to worry about is Henry Wallace. And Henry Wallace on the far left, drawing over black votes, and what this could mean in the North, in like New York City or California, Los Angeles, Illinois, states like that, or even now Detroit or in Ohio. The swing states, the black vote becomes increasingly important in that year. So under that pressure, Truman is going to move to integrate the armed services. But after the 1948 election, I'm hard pressed to name what he does in terms of carrying forward on that.
I'm curious, when you look at the 1920 book and you have these six guys, if you were going to map out what might happen, TR not even making it into the fight, Wilson ending up stroked into the oblivion, basically, and Harding president for 10 minutes, and then Coolidge, you wouldn't have picked that path. And then FDR being the long-term winner in terms of multiple, administrations.
No. And FDR is not ready for prime time at that spot, 12 years is a long time to be between spots on a national ticket. And those are 12 years of growth. You wouldn't pick him to get polio either. Okay. So the polio is a big factor in his personal and political growth. He was probably gallivanting a bit too much around before that, but having to sit around and rest and reflect, and also that, kind of have people come to him more and more, all work in his favor. So, and of course, it's not just in the 12 years, it's 8 years when he is elected as sort of a substitute for Al Smith as governor of New York. And he wins very narrowly that year and proceeds to hone his skills. He also gets those 4 years as governor of New York to practice things. Not that it's like a small stage to practice on, but, it's not like he's going into the presidency cold on any measure. And he also puts he puts together a great political team with Lewis McHenry Howe, who has been with him in 1920, a former newspaper man, and then with Jim Farley, who is this great behind the scenes political guy from New York City, not a Tammany Democrat, but also Flynn from the Bronx, again, not Tammany, but a big skillful political guy. So he has this team building, and then he has the brain trust, which I think is really unique, or not unique, but unprecedented in American politics, where he comes in with guys like Rexford Tugwell and Raymond Moley, and people like that, and who are able to craft speeches. Speech writing for the presidency was a fairly new thing. Harding is really the first guy to use it to any extent. Coolidge reverts to pretty much doing only his own. But Roosevelt is like a Hollywood studio. He's the man on the screen that you see. But behind him are all these, guys cobbling together the sets and putting the costumes together, and particularly writing the scripts. So as Hollywood puts a whole bunch of screenwriters in the room to put a screenplay together, Roosevelt has the same thing with his screenwriting team, or his speech writing team, with guys like Ray Moley and Sam Roseman, and eventually Robert Sherwood, a Pulitzer Prize winner. Very talented guys. But then what he does is he doesn't just read the lines. He puts his own spin and emphasis on it, and he works. He works on practicing his delivery so that when he goes on the radio or before a 100,000 person crowd, or before the newsreel, he's going to do it. He's going to do it well, and he's going to be this great performer. And of course, he's following a couple of guys who weren't great performers, Hoover and Coolidge. So he's like a breath of fresh air after 9 years of less than, shall we say, riveting performers. Harding probably would have been a great performer on the cameras and on the radio, and also Wilson and TR. But those guys are preceding the radio, preceding the talking, preceding the newsreels, and Roosevelt arrives at just the right time. Hoover had been offered spots on the radio, but with his usual political brilliance, turned them down. And maybe he would have inspired the public a bit more, but I kind of even doubt that.
I'm curious. I have one more question, and then I'm going to let Josiah ask the last question. But I'm always fascinated by these moments in history where there's one last hurdle to beat, and then the path clears out. And the example I often use is that when President Obama is State Senator Obama and he's going to run for Senate, Mike Ditka is considering a run himself, and obviously polls way better than Barack Obama. But Mike Ditka's like, why the hell would I want that job? And he doesn't go for it. So once he gets past Ditka, the road is a lot clearer, because if Mike Ditka runs, he becomes senator. We probably never see a President Obama. So what are some of those?
Wasn't there a higher profile black woman who seemed to be in line, but then she got thrown off the ballot or something like that?
That was,
I believe,
that was when he ran for House member.
Oh, that's right. That was right. That's right. Yes. Again, history is held on slender thread.
Right. What else stands out in your mind? Are those times where, like, if this guy had lived, if whatever, if this backdoor deal had gone the other way, we'd have a totally different outcome.
Well, all of those things. If McKinley isn't shot, if the security is a bit better, if McKinley's vice president Garrett Hobart doesn't die, right. If that streetcar, which goes crashing into TR's car in Pittsfield, Massachusetts in like 1903, doesn't kill a Secret Service man, but kills him. Okay. It's always, this alternate history of what if, or if the judge McCammon from Oregon doesn't stand up and like flummox everybody, and instead of nominating Irvine Lenroot for vice president in 1923, nominates Calvin Coolidge, and the convention stampedes. President Irvine Lenroot, really? Okay. Or if Bora doesn't turn down the vice presidency in 1920 because he's William A.E. Bora and is just the most obstreperous guy, period. And says, I don't want it. And then somehow slides into the vice presidency in 1928, has a very much more progressive Republican presidency and a more progressive presidency to deal with the Depression. Or if Al Smith somehow beats Hoover in 1928 and has the Depression, what happens then? What happens then? And then it's the Democrats are the Depression party, and the Republicans are the get us back to work party. Again, it's again, what if? Never
stop. Whose life did Robert Todd Lincoln save at the train station? I forget who he grabbed somebody and pulled him back or something.
Well, he didn't. I don't think he certainly didn't save Garfield's, but he was there. And John Hay was Secretary of State for McKinley. So you see a lot of those connections from one assassination to the other. Or what if Giuseppe Zangara is a couple inches taller and can get a clearer shot off at FDR in January of 1933 instead of killing Mayor Cermak of Chicago? You know,
how about
President John Nance Garner? Who knew?
Or if TR had a slightly less thick speech when that bullet hits him in the chest, you know?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I was just doing a podcast on the D-Day, and what saved Scotty's life from Star Trek. Okay, remember Scotty from Star Trek?
Yeah.
He was on the beach killing German snipers, and a cigarette case saved his life when a bullet went through that. Otherwise, it would have killed him. So smoking is good for you on D-Day, but nowhere else.
Josiah, do you have
Yeah, so you've done 4 of these election campaign books, and I was just curious: if you were going to do another one, are there years that are kind of out?
Lost the sound.
Oh, can you not hear me anymore?
I seem to have lost the sound, so I'm not going to answer the question I don't hear. And I think I know what the question is, but I'm not going to answer it.
Very diplomatic, yeah.
Okay, let me wrap this up. First off, fantastic. I appreciate it. Everybody should go get 1920. There's the link on the page. If you're on the podcast side, go check out the show notes. It'll be in there. I'd love to have you back on. I'm going to start chewing through all the books. You've got a super fan in me. I can't wait to just buy each one and just go through the whole thing. So I love baseball. I love that era of history, and I love that you've got all these things out there that break it down, and I love that stuff.
Well, thank you.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you so much for watching the Break It Down Show.